Julianne last semester at the Faith and Learning seminar that we participated in. Brian was there too, with the Faculty Center. And we were talking at our college curriculum council about what topics and who to invite to speak. And we had an idea from one person that was, let's invite someone from outside the college. And so we went through a number of names and we came up with yours. Yeah. And Julianne received the Carl G. Mazur Teaching Award this last fall. And she earned her bachelor's degree in chemistry and her PhD in biology at the University of Utah, where her research focused on the study of metabolism and salmonella. Try to stay away from that. As a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Utah Biochemistry Department, Huntsman Cancer Institute, she continued her study of metabolism with a focus on the protein PAS kinase and its connections to diabetes and obesity. From 2006 to 2008, Julianne served as a lead scientist for the pharmaceutical company Bioenergenics, is that right? Where she aided in developing an inhibitor of PAS kinase that is expected to enter clinical trials this year. She joined the faculty of the Microbiology and Molecular Biology Department of BYU in 2008, where she enjoys teaching phage hunters. That sounds like a fun class.
We're going to talk about it.
Okay,
yeah.
Good. A hands-on learning program developed by herself, John Breakwell, and Sandra Hope through the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. She also continues phage research in her laboratory, along with her study of diabetes. She also loves spending time outdoors, particularly southern Utah, with her husband and 3 children. Welcome.
So it's always humbling to try to give a talk on teaching to a whole bunch of good teachers, right? That I'm sure that I could learn a lot from each of you. And I think that I don't spend enough time visiting other classrooms. And often we're constrained, I think this is a great idea, because often we're constrained to visiting classrooms within our own department or even college, right? And it's rare that we go outside of the department or college to talk to someone else. And yet I truly believe that the fundamental principles of great teaching are independent of your subject, right? And independent of what you're doing. But and there were so many things that I thought about talking about today, but I decided that the thing that has changed me the most as a teacher, and one of the concepts that I believe in the most, is this idea of hands-on learning and experiential learning, which President Worthen has really been focusing on, right, in his talks. And it's one of the best ways that we can meet the goals of BYU, I think, to provide learning that's spiritually strengthening, intellectual enlarging, character building, leading to lifelong learning and service, because for many, many reasons. And I want to talk about like how I really came to the point where I'm at, where I now only teach hands-on classes. I don't teach a single lecture-based class. And I want to talk about how I got there and why I do that and why I believe in that. So when I started here in 2008, I was mostly teaching 2 classes, which are on the top. A general micro class. This was like a couple hundred students, because every pre-dental student and pre-nursing student has to take that class, right? So you get a bunch of students in there, a couple hundred, a lot of them don't want to be there. It's the only microbiology class they'll ever have, which is a scary thought, considering they transfer a lot of microbes around. And but it's really lecture-based because of the large number of students. The second class I was teaching was our microbiology for majors. And this was for freshmen, and there were only about 25 students in the class because we had 3 hours a week lecture and 3 hours a week lab. But the thing was is that the labs were really what I would call cookbook labs, which is why I have a cookbook up there, right? So they were labs where we already knew what the answer was. We had already done the experiment. We knew what the answer was, and the student was doing something where they were guaranteed success, and there was a right answer to get. Does that make sense? And so I was primarily teaching those 2 classes, and when I joined here, Sandra Hope and Don Breckwell in my department were applying to a Howard Hughes Medical Institute program called Phage Hunters. And this program was about getting out of these cookbook labs and into doing novel research, bringing students into novel research. So the whole point of the Howard Hughes program is that students go out into the environment, they isolate a virus, so phage is another word for virus, but phages are specific to bacteria. So that's why they're given a different term. So they won't infect humans. They isolate a virus that's in the environment. There are actually 10 to the 32 on the planet. So when they go out and isolate one randomly from the environment, it's always something novel that no one has ever seen before. And they get to name it, some crazy name. Sometimes they name it. One of the craziest was YOLO Swag. One of my students last year named their virus YOLO Swag. But they can name it whatever they want under the sun. And it's a fabulous learning activity because they're learning not just wet lab, but they actually do like electron microscopy to view their virus under the microscope. They, like I said, name their virus. They isolate the DNA. We sequence the DNA. They look at the DNA and they compare it to other known viruses. And they get this really broad introduction to biology where they're learning more than they do in any other course. Okay?
How many students did you say is in that class?
So now, this year I have 48. But when I started, we had about 15. So because Sandra and Dawn were starting this, and I thought, that's what I believe in. I think that class is going to be what I want to do. I started teaching it with them like immediately. So I've taught it for 9 years. And been a part of that for 9 years. I also, during this time, started another class called iGEM, which I'm going to talk about because I was trying to decide what I really wanted to focus on, what was the best way. So this is a similar program. It's called iGEM because it is an international program. It's called the International Genetically Engineered Machine, where you actually try to have your students build a machine out of E. coli or another microbe. So have it do some sort of work for you. So it's another program this one's primarily just at the national level. This one's international. But it's a program that you can join. And one of the advantages to joining an existing program is that there are colleagues, right? There are people for you to talk to, and beyond that, there are people for your students to talk to, right? Yeah.
So I was just wondering, just so I can understand the big picture,
Yeah.
are these classes replacing the ones above them? or-
They're not replacing.
Okay.
So
Still have the,
we still have this class and this class. These we were developing. I was alone in developing this one. This one I had Dawn and Sandra, which was great. And basically I was trying to find other alternatives to those. Does that make sense? They haven't replaced those in our department because we haven't found a way to run 300 students through Phage Hunters. And that's a big hurdle I want to talk about. I want to talk about the hurdles to some of this.
Do you have any prerequisites for your courses?
This was a junior seniors class. This was anybody.
Okay.
So there was this one. I'm going to talk more about both of these because they are different from one another. But what I want to say is over this time, teaching all 4 of those classes, I really became converted. I became a convert to hands-on learning, right? So, and everywhere I looked, it seemed like I was getting data to support my conversion, right? Instead of data that would argue with it. So when I looked at any research on teaching and learning, hands-on is always the best, right? That's where students learn the most. And the student testimonials and my student ratings were like 4.7, 4.8 in my hands-on classes. And in my lecture-based classes, I couldn't seem to get them above like a 4.4, right? Like the students and the comments I was getting back from them were astronomical. I have students, just last week, I had a student come in and say, graduation is approaching for my Phage Hunters class. I just want to tell you that I never understood the basics of biology. I never even understood cellular transcription, translation, replication. These are the basics of biology that you learn in an intro biology class until I took this class, Phage Hunters, as a senior. Okay, so these are the student testimonials that I get over and over and over again on the hands-on learning. So over the years, these were building up, right? And then, of course, my own experience. As he told you in the intro, I was a chemistry and math major who, during my senior year, I took one biology course, and I loved it. And that professor got me working in his lab, encouraged me to apply to graduate school, and I went to got a PhD in biology. But the weird thing is when I joined the PhD program, I was scared. I was like, I've only ever had one biology class, and I'm taking these advanced classes with students who were biology majors, right? And yet I was finding out that I knew more than they did, or at least I knew it more in-depthly because I had used it in the lab. I hadn't learned it in a classroom. I had learned it from necessity, from having to understand it to be able to do my lab work. So I thought about my own experience and the way that I learned best. And then it was funny because I kept thinking about this, of course, at church and gospel things. Everything from our premortal life, when we're in our desire to be good and like our Heavenly Father, we weren't able to achieve that from a lecture, right? We could sit in premortal life and agree with Heavenly Father, yes, this is what I want, this is the plan, I want to be good, I want to do this, I want to do that, I want to do this. But we couldn't become that, and we couldn't learn that without experience, right? So to me, it's just kind of really clear over time that I don't want to be teaching these classes anymore. These are the classes that I want to do. I want to do the hands-on classes. And I want to have a discussion with you guys about how we do that, because this isn't science specific, right? This is any discipline. But there are definite challenges from it. I kind of skipped over that. Like I kept finding scriptures and everything that just kept popping out to me, that experience is how we learn, even if you're a perfect being, right? It's from experience that we truly learn and build upon things. And President Kevin J. Worthen, of course, has really, really emphasized this. He says experience is a key part of our mortal learning process. Similarly, students cannot learn all they need to by memorizing or even discussing principles in a classroom. As exhilarating as that may be, experience connects theory with application and deepens our understanding. And I know that that's true. And if you look at the biology behind it, it makes perfect sense, because our brain is just a machine. And the deeper the connections are, and the more interconnections there are, the more learning that occurs, right? And the longer that stays with someone and their experience. But there are a lot of challenges to this. So in developing these two classes, I no longer teach this one. I'm going to tell you that up front. All my effort now goes into this one. And it's unfortunate. This is a great program and a great class too. But there are many things that you have to think about, because you have to think about cost, right? How much can we afford to put into this class? Because research usually does have a cost to it. And then the time, how much time do you have to spend on it? How much time do the students have to spend on it? Because you have to be aware that their time is limited too. You have to know, is it an appropriate level? Are they actually going to be able to accomplish something in a semester? Because you don't want them to be walking out of there feeling like they weren't able to get anything done that they wanted to do, right? And this is a challenging part of it for me, finding something that's appropriate. And then I love this last part, having an outside support and community. That's why I really looked for organizations and programs that were already going, hands-on programs that were going either nationally or internationally, saying what community is there and support available for not only me, but for my students, so that they can blog and chat with people across the country who are doing a similar project, right? So these were kind of the main considerations that I went into. And like I said, I started both of these programs and classes. Since then, teaching both was just like way too crazy for me. And I eventually have just adapted to this. And the reason is that this one is cheaper, less time intensive. All students are guaranteed success, basically. Anybody can isolate a virus, trust me. And the outside support and community was better. So all those things fell into this. This was much more challenging for the students. It's definitely just a junior or senior level They need a lot more background, and some of them weren't successful during the class because it was just very challenging. So that's why I've since switched to these things, and these are really the key points that I see. Is there anything else that you guys can think of that might have to do more with your discipline that should be up there?
I have a question.
Yeah.
What about changing the courses before they get to the junior, senior year so that IGM would work?
Yeah, that could definitely, if it were a focus earlier on. I'm not saying that this is a bad idea. The biggest reason for me dropping this is this was growing, and I couldn't do both. Does that make sense? I had to make a decision which one I was going to do. Because I came to a point where I said, I can't do both of these well. Yeah.
I have an administrator level question. How does it work in terms of workload among the faculty and fitting into the curriculum and that kind of thing? I assume that's a challenge as well.
That's also a challenge. So part of the challenge here was getting people to accept this to replace other classes, right? So this now is part of our, major, part of our microbiology or molecular biology major. It's not a required class, but it's an elective. They could choose from a couple options, right? And so then it does decrease load. But you have to have buy-in, and that's another thing. And that took a little bit of time. So at first I was just spending a lot of time teaching all of these classes until I got buy-in from the department that this should be part of our major.
So do you still teach the lecture class?
I don't teach either of those,
So
no.
someone else is teaching them though?
Yep, but there's less load on those because this counts towards the major instead.
So it can be, you can take either or.
You can take this or this.
There's less load on them, but there's 2 sections instead of 1 section. Is that right?
2 sections of this.
No.
There is 2 sections of this now instead of one.
One
But
person's teaching this and one person's teaching this instead of one person teaching a big section of this.
this was never big because this was also a lab. So both of these are limited by lab space, so there are only 24 students can fit in a lab.
I see.
Yeah. So there
in
are
terms of the
logistics.
total
There are
number-
logistics
yeah.
like that, right? And that is that's why I really wanted to give this talk. Is people are really, really scared. Okay, they're frightened of moving away from the lecture model. They think that their student is not going to learn as much in here. I can tell you that there's a lot of data on hands-on learning now. And I can tell you from personal experience that these students are learning a heck of a lot more in here than they are in here. Even having the same teacher, even me teaching this versus that, right? Exact same teacher. This is where they're learning. Yeah.
I guess the concern is they're learning a lot about one specific thing. What's the trade-off then if they're not learning about the other things you would normally learn
Okay.
in the general course?
So that is hard. That should be one thing that's on here, right? Is it should be, I guess, the breadth of that project, okay? So in this class, we learn everything that they learn in there. We
You can
discuss every
imagine
single
that.
thing that was ever discussed in there.
So how do students, how are the students choosing between the two?
Right now, they just randomly do.
Randomly, they don't really make a conscious decision of why they do
It's
one
not
or
a word
the
of
other?
mouth?
It's word of mouth mostly. And so the people who end up in here are almost always saying, yeah, like my friend took this, or my sibling took this, or usually it's word of mouth.
Is there majors micro class? Is it more hands-on now, or is it still the traditional 3 hours of lecture or 3 hours?
It's still the traditional and cookbook lab.
So is it all focused lab things, or I'm just curious.
What this class is like?
Well, yeah, I mean, how
Yeah.
does the student stay oriented? Because
Yeah.
students will freak out if they don't have something on the schedule and some guidance to be done.
Yeah, absolutely. So this has set lab hours. It's Tuesday, Thursday from noon to 3. And on Tuesdays, we do have a 1-hour discussion. It's not a lecture. So Tuesdays at noon, for 1 hour, we have a discussion. And that is where they learn that 1 hour on Tuesday, what they're going to be doing, what they need to be doing in lab that week. but they have a lot of individuality in this. So all the students are at different places. Some students get their virus the very first week, and then they're moving on to like isolating the DNA and doing electron microscopy. Other people are like 2 months into the class and still don't have their virus, right? So they're all at different parts, but that discussion time brings the whole class together, and we discuss all the basic concepts. But what's really cool is that when I say they learn everything that they're learning in there, to isolate a virus, you have to learn about cell structure, you have to learn about viral structure, you have to learn about DNA replication, you have to learn about transcription, translation, you have to learn all the basics that are in there. But instead, you're learning it in the wet lab.
Do they have a textbook in the 100?
There's no textbook. I'm actually writing one right now because there's nothing available. I've looked and looked for something I could use, like a chapter here or a chapter there, and there's
Are there
nothing.
readings for that class?
Huh?
Are there readings for the 100th class?
Yes. There are readings that I have them do, and they're like selections from this place and that place. Sometimes they're even vlogs or videos to watch. Yeah.
I don't know if you wanted to keep on going. I have a larger question.
I want a discussion. I didn't want to just, yeah.
So, I mean, what you're seeming to say is that you think that there's better learning going on in the FHSS class than in the majors micro class.
Absolutely.
What would it take to convert the general micro class into an experiential learning class?
It would take a lot of hours from a professor, another professor, right? Because I can't teach a whole bunch of sections of it.
So you have, first thing you have to do is you have to cut down from 200 to lab sizes of 24 or so?
Well, this does have a lab. It's limited to 24, and this is limited to 24.
Okay.
So if you added one more teacher,
But it's a lot more hours. So here, this is 3 hours a week lecture and 3 hours a week lab. So it's really 6 hours, and this is 6 hours, right? This has, I should have put 1 hour lecture / discussion, because it does. We meet not in the lab, we meet in a discussion room for 1 hour, and 5 hours of lab. So hours-wise, they're really equivalent, but right now, this lab, because so many people are run through it, is mostly run by TAs and stuff. This lab could never be run well by TAs because it's so complex. Like I told you, because they're doing novel research, the students aren't all at the same step. There's a lot of troubleshooting. I've been gone to a conference or something for 2 weeks and come back and have like a student who's been trying to isolate what they thought was a virus, and it was like a popped bubble on the plate, you know? It's like bad things happen when an instructor is not there. And that's part of why these are so popular. These are easier, they're cheaper, they're less time intensive for the professor. There's all kinds of advantages I can shout out for here, but I'm saying that this is worth it.
So going back to this question though, so what do you do for 300 students then?
Yeah, what do you do for 300 is, I am pushing that everything gets moved this way, right? But
So
it would
requires more
require-
department resources that because you can't do it at 300. Is that what you're saying? That you
no,
have,
you could do it at 300, but I would have to have other professors buy in and say, okay, I'm not going to teach that anymore, I'm going to teach this.
But I think when you have the lecture class, the labs are smaller, but the lecture's still big.
No.
It's not, it's
So
small too.
The general micro or the?
No,
majors
big.
micro?
It's small too,
So
it's
they're
small
both-
too,
So
yeah,
a teacher's working with 24 students.
yep.
So basically saying you have to double the teacher time when you move to this model.
Double teacher class time, but that was part of what I wanted to know.
It's not really doubling, well, it is doubling the teacher class time. And it's also just doubling the work. Like, it's just a lot of work.
Yeah.
That was, I was wondering, in the 6 hours,
I'm gonna be honest.
when you have students sitting in a lecture, they think they understand everything, they don't have questions, but when you're making them do something, they know they have questions.
Then they figure out their question.
Then
That's
they're-
exactly right.
Then they're coming to take up a more additional time out of class from you.
Do you want to know the thing that's surprising? And I rarely see my FHSS students out of class. They're asking me in class. And I think it's because I have a very different relationship with my FHSS students than I ever had with my students in these lecture classes. They're asking their questions immediately in class.
But that's because of the structure of your.
It is the structure of the class, because they can just walk up to me and ask a question.
So then it's less than twice the time, most likely.
Maybe, yeah, I think it is less. I think you're right. Because I hadn't thought about that, to tell you the truth. I no longer have a lot of students. I never get students at my office hours anymore. It's shocking. Besides to ask for a letter of rec, that still happens.
Julian,
Yeah.
you mentioned that the students in the FH Honors class are learning more than the students. Is
Yeah.
there any evidence? Are they
There,
taking
yeah,
exit exams?
that's actually
Are they-
what I have at the end. So I'll go back to. So this is why I'm saying this is why it's worth it. So when I first started teaching, my learning objectives were really like, oh, I want them to learn transcription. I want them to learn translation. I want them to learn self-structure. I want them to learn, all these different things. And now these are my learning objectives. Right? I want students to interpret results and data. I want them to feel ownership of their project. I want them to engage with the scientific community. I want students to think like scientists. I want them to see themselves as capable scientists. I want them to have a positive impression of science. I want them to want to take more science classes. So my objectives have completely changed, and who I am as a teacher has completely changed. But here's the data. So as part of this is another great thing about reaching out to an ongoing national or international group that's already doing something, right? And we reached out when there were only a couple to Howard Hughes, when there were only about 10 schools involved, and now there's close to 100. And this is a publication that I was on with them from last year, where they looked at the course type comparison, so a general micro class versus this class, and the learning that occurred. And you can see the blue is our FH Hunters class, right? The high intent to stay in the sciences, blue again is FH Hunters class. First generation students, women, underrepresented minority, and we looked at underrepresented males. We looked at all different kinds of things. So in every case, this is their overall impression. Do they want to persist in science? What did they learn? How much did they learn? Right. So in every case, and when Howard Hughes started this FH Hunters program, we were actually in the second year, the second cohort. They said, we just don't want to do any harm from this class. We don't know if it will do any good. We're hoping that it doesn't do any harm. But it's doing a tremendous amount of good. This is 100 schools, thousands of students, 9 years worth of data. Yeah.
I was just going to say, speaking to the earlier concern about students freaking out, I tell our students that it's better that they freak out now than when they freak out when they're in a job, right? And
Absolutely.
actually
They
ask
can't see that far
things
ahead, though.
They can't see that far ahead.
They don't.
And there is some pushback from some students. Like I said, most of the time my ratings are really, really high in this class. But I'd say every other semester I get one student who just hates it. This is not the traditional lecture class. Give me my lecture class. What are you doing? They just kind of freak out and don't enjoy it. And maybe they learn differently and the class isn't going to work for them, right?
It makes you
That's
think
a
maybe the world
possibility.
isn't going to work for them, right?
Yeah.
The world doesn't give you lectures about how to raise kids, how to do your job.
True.
So it there's a misfit there that I think we run into. But I was going to say, I'm totally sold on this, and this is part of the reason why I'm in anthropology. And we have sort of this almost on a larger scale, because we do it across 4 semesters, where they design their own research project, they learn about how to do research, they go carry it out, they come back and analyze it, and then write it up, and that's the 4-semester sequence. So there's ways to do it sort of on a bigger scale, but I also wonder if there's ways to do it on a smaller scale, in that sense of just smaller projects within lecture-type classes, potentially.
I think for sure. I think you could even just bring into your lecture type class real data, some of your data, right?
Yeah.
Have them analyze it.
Yeah, and I wondered with the big lecture class, if that could be done, if it's just a matter of sort of bringing it down to a level that's easier to manage, right? Because it sounds like your FH Hunters is and microbiology might just be impossible to bring to a level that you can do that, but the 300 students, and there's an example of this in anthropology. There was a guy, Mike Wesh, who came here probably 4 years ago as a devotional, or a forum speaker, sorry, not devotional. He was a forum speaker, but he does these things in his classes where it's like he's trying to teach world systems about how world systems work. And he'll take these huge 200, 300 people classes and split them up into, each group will become a country. And then he'll have this massive sort of world simulation exercise where they have all these things they have to do and sort of encounter each other in various ways. And they have exchange relationships, they have all kinds of other things that they do. And it's like, I mean, they literally, they go outside of the classroom. And normally they're in a big lecture hall, but they go out and do this. And so, I mean, it gets me thinking about the possibilities, that there might be something with the big 300 level.
There is absolutely things.
Yeah.
You can absolutely change your classes. The thing is, I think it's just been so ingrained for so many years that people still don't trust this, despite, I cannot tell you the number of research papers out there on hands-on learning now, right? I mean, the statistics are incredible. And even this, I didn't show the graph for this, but one of the exiting questionnaires is strictly scientific data. So about transcription, translation, cell structure, and the students in the FHSS class do better than the students in the micro majors class at that, right? So they did learn more of the basics. And so there's study after study on it, and yet most of us are still really afraid to not do a lecture. We're afraid the students are going to miss something and not get something, and I think it's, like I said, it's kind of ingrained in us.
Question about the politics. You talked about getting buy-in, and
Yeah.
that was difficult. And
That
I
is
could
difficult.
see this not happening in a department for political reasons, where if I mean, it sounds like it was a lot of work. You had to maybe be given some. Were you just working nights and weekends, or were you given some?
I
kind of
was
break?
working a lot. Yeah, I was working a lot. Luckily, I had buy-in from Sandra Hope and Don Breckwell with the FHSS course, right? Who took on some of the work too. That was really important. And then they've slowly phased out of teaching it, but we got department buy-in before that happened, right? So, like, having data to show your department is really, really helpful, and getting them to come down. And a lot of what happened for me, it took years, because what happened was, like, the students who had been in that class, in the FHSS class, were then in other people's classes or joining other people's labs, and they were really impressed with them. Does that make sense? So it took time for that buy-in, but it was there because the results were there. So that is something I have to be honest and upfront about. Like, it's not easy for a while. It's more work until you get that buy-in. But I'm hoping that talking to people like this will get people to buy in, right? Yeah.
So it seems like the easiest lab to run would be one that's directly related to the own research you're doing.
Yeah.
So what's the trade-off? I mean, I would love it to have a class where I have a bunch of students working on questions related to my research. What's
Yeah.
the trade-off of that, of taking it directly to your own research?
I think that's absolutely possible. I couldn't figure out a really good way to do that for my own research. Luckily, I had phage research during my graduate work. It wasn't my postdoc work, but during my graduate work, and so it was easy for me to buy into this phage hunters program. But I did consider instead running more of my research in the lab, and unfortunately, my research was harder for undergraduates to do. There are ways I definitely could have done it. I thought of different aspects of the research that the undergraduates I thought could handle. And then ultimately, I decided to go with the phage program, the national program, for that community and support for both me and the students. But I'm not saying that was the right decision. I think the other could work, especially depending on whatever your research is. And there's not one right way to do this. So I should mention now that I don't just teach phage hunters, but I teach all things related to phage hunters. So I teach the 2 sections of phage hunters, which is it's a year-long class. So they have first semester and second semester. And then I also teach our graduate genomics class, in which which is just one semester, and it's just one lecture a week. But I take them, it's like a mini phage hunters, like you were talking about, a mini aspect of it. So we don't always get through all of our phage genome, all of our DNA analyzed and stuff. And so that graduate project now takes on the leftover genomes and the leftover work, and they often finish up publications that the other undergraduates couldn't finish up. So it's great because they're getting a similar but higher level experience. Like you were talking about, a little piece of it that branched off and is now our graduate genomics class. And then I teach an honors class where that's a combination with someone, Cynthia Hallen from linguistics, where we do DNA as a language. And once again, we use our leftover DNA and genomes from phage hunters that the undergraduates didn't finish and bring it into that class. So definitely it's possible to do different iterations of this.
And I guess that's why I was asking the question,
Basic
like
idea.
specific topic versus general. Because definitely if you bring them into your research area, you're kind of funneling them into a very narrow topic. And so I'm trying to think of how to supplement the narrow.
But I'm sure your narrow topic, you have to have big picture understanding for it, right?
But then the question is, do I end up teaching the big picture stuff, or do you just have them read a book, or?
So in our discussions, we go through the big picture stuff. That's really what happens in that 1 hour a week discussion. Yeah.
For us, and I don't know the breadth of the econ methodologies, but in sociology we have a variety of different kinds of methodologies. So, I mean, more variability than I'm guessing in the pursuit of viruses. And so this would be a practical thing that we have to grapple with. I don't know if we get it, but that's something, because there's the broad issues about the discipline, but then there's the specific methodologies that you would potentially be closing them off to.
This reminds me of the medical schools that are going to the clinically based.
Absolutely.
They actually tackle the whole curriculum at once, right? And
They do.
first-year med students are seeing patients, and then they're learning the concepts through the clinical work, and it's a very frightening thing for the physicians, I think, because they're thinking this.
They don't know anything.
They don't know anything when they're seeing a patient, and then they get it sort of, the negative way to say it is sort of hodgepodge, right?
Right.
But there's still good evidence that they learn it. So I mean, you got to wonder how they sort of make the argument for these are the concepts we think they need to learn. Here's how they learn it through the clinical path versus the lecture-based path.
Yeah, and I mean, that's really what we had to do with phage hunters, is decide, what are they learning in, where did it go? What are they learning here that we're missing here? Is there anything that we're missing? And you do have to look at that. But most of the time, this is a narrow part of biology, right? This is a narrow funnel. But this project takes in all the broadness of biology.
Have you done any type of flip in the class where you give materials that have some way of evaluating their understanding outside of class, and then when they come, they do the clinical or the hands-on?
I haven't done that. Yeah. They do have like a weekly assignment that they do outside of class.
But there's not where it's flipped and they get the in-class lecture type stuff on
online or something.
Online, whatever works, and then come and apply.
No, but there's a lot of evidence that those classes work well, right? Where people listen to the lecture or whatever before class and then just come in and have a discussion. And that would work well with a research project like this, right? Having all that information, if you needed to, learned
So you
before
get
they
the broad
come.
stuff and then focus it on the hands-on.
Absolutely.
So I taught an intro to sociology course for 9 years in a row, and there were almost 200 students in it. And by the time I was done, my prep time was about 10 minutes.
That's right.
And so that's one of the things I'm wondering is and there's this economy and repeating, and does that not happen?
It happens for me.
It does.
Absolutely. Yeah. I do very little outside of class now.
I'm just curious, with this program, do you get outside funding then through the Howard Hughes Foundation, or?
Yes, so they funded it for the first 2 years. And then this was the great thing for us, is that we had a student in the class with a wealthy family who loved the class, and then their father donated and supported it, and has supported it since.
And is there college and departmental supports as well that come
Yep.
into it?
Yep.
Well, what's the extra expense compared to the majors? Is this supplies, the lab supplies?
The most expensive thing about this class is the DNA sequencing, which they don't generally do. Otherwise, the lab supplies are in equal cost to this lab. But that's mostly what we need extra money for, is sequencing the DNA. That price will probably goes down every year.
Yeah.
So maybe one day it will be negligible.
So can you give us some practical advice here? We have our dean, we have some other departments, we're all social scientists. I mean, so imagine we want to do this. What do we, what's your advice? What's the next?
So my advice is actually, I think I didn't think about it as much as I should have. If I had thought through things really carefully, I probably would have decided earlier on that this was the smarter class, not that. That would have saved me a lot of time and energy.
Are you suggesting the first step would be going back to that other slide where it changed the objectives of the course?
Is it?
Just get the keyboard and click back on the slide.
Oh, I see. I've selected something. I didn't see that. I think this is what you should really focus on, personally. Thinking about the cost, the time. Is it at an appropriate level? The outside support. And I guess the thing that I didn't have on there was, does it cover all the general knowledge that you want? Can you cover all the general knowledge? Bring it into that class.
Have you ever had problems with accreditation?
No. No, our students have to take an exiting exam that it's like a national biology exam, and they do really well on it.
You have students who've taken this class, the FH class, have they done better on the exit exam in your
We have
department?
never looked at that. We really should. I don't know why I've never thought to look at that until, it was funny, because right when you started your question, I knew what you were gonna ask. I was like, I should look at that. We have all that data, so it'd be easy for me to go back and just pull my students from there. Yeah, it's a great idea.
But I thought you mentioned when you had the multiple bar graphs that was all attitudinal, but I thought you mentioned that there was some.
In that same
performance
publication, we have like 5 years worth of data from like 80 schools, thousands of students taking a general biology exam. Yeah.
So question for you. Wouldn't the university help fund something like this with the new?
Experiential learning
Yeah.
Probably,
funds.
to me, the sort of administrative practical thing is, I can see how if you have a 24-person section and you can do it this way or this way, that's an easy matchup. But let's say I take a 250-person intro to anthropology or
Yeah.
sociology or psychology, either have to, everyone would rather teach a 24-person section of that that's experiential than.
Yeah, we have that problem here too with our general micro class. Yeah, that doesn't have a lab normally.
Now I need 8 teachers instead of 1.
It's
And
true.
So then you have to do what Greg was talking about, where you have to have some other, like the forum speaker, right? You have to find some other way.
But I think like this isn't the only model, right? I think you could do it, and I could teach a FH Hunters class with 200 students with data from the other class, right? Data from somewhere else. So that they really wouldn't have the wet lab part, but they would have the dry lab part, which is probably just as good, analyzing the data and interpreting it.
Certain kinds of topics seem to lend themselves to this too, because you.
That's what I'm saying. I think it takes time. I would spend a lot more time than I did really analyzing a couple different ideas and deciding which one is really going to fly. Anyway.
questions.
Well, it's very provocative.
Yeah.
It was fun talking to you guys, thanks.
Thanks, Julian, thanks for coming.
Thank you.